Welcome to She Rebel Radio, the podcast for high-performing women leaders who want to unlearn conventional rules, leave prestigious careers, and launch businesses of significance. Each week, She Rebel Radio brings you insights and advice from women entrepreneurs who transformed their prestige prisons into daring entrepreneurial success stories. Now, here is your host, Lulu Nins.
Welcome to episode 59 of She Rebel Radio, Discovering Your Wounded Visionary. Welcome, ladies. It is She Rebel Friday, an honour to have you here. And we celebrate our birthday today at the end of our birthday month, as it is a year, the 26th of September, that I launched She Rebel Radio, which is also my personal birthday. So happy birthday to me too. But it is the birthday of She Rebel Radio. We have been running for a full year. We have had 59 incredible episodes, which I hope you have enjoyed. And I know those of you that are avid fans of She Rebel Radio have listened to many of those episodes back again, but if you're new to She Rebel Radio, please do stay with us, and there are 58 other episodes for you to listen to. This has been an absolute passion project for me. It's been better than I anticipated. The feedback's been better than I've anticipated, and we are going for 5,000 downloads this month, and then who knows what the following year will bring. I know the content has resonated with so many of you in terms of having a very feminine narrative for women and women in business, and today is no different. Now, I procrastinated about sharing with you on our birthday episode, Discovering Your Wounded Visionary. I didn't want to sound super miserable on my birthday, but it is, I'm not a lover of birthdays, but it's a really good time to reflect, and it's a good time to, look at what needs to change and how we step forward. And it was the perfect episode that really naturally has been permeating around with me to share with you for quite some time, and the perfect finish to the heart-based series. We've had two incredible guests on this month, and also we kicked off the month with Half-Assed and Full-Hearted, which I know resonated with so many of you. But in order to do that full-heartedness, we have to look into and discover the wounded visionary, our wounded visionary, which is what we're going to be doing on this episode today. We have to look into how we heal that part of ourselves. And we finally, during this episode, will look at why you personally need to heal your wounded visionary, but why we also need to do that as a collective. So hold on tight. This is going to be a good episode, an emotional one at times. But, as I said, if you're anything like me, emotions often come up at a birthday. It's time for new energy. It's looking back at the year, so far, or the 10 years if it's a big birthday. This is the last birthday in my 30s. So it kind of is a big birthday in some ways. And, we're reflecting on what we've been creating on She Rebel Radio this past year, and, looking at where we're at in the world. It's not been the easiest year, right? There's been big changes happening, and there needs to be a big way forward, which we're going to be looking into. So let's start with discovering your wounded visionary. Now, there are those of you, I think many of you, not all, I definitely recommend the book by Simon Sinek, Start With Why. I've mentioned it in previous episodes. It didn't massively resonate with me when I first started out on my entrepreneurial business journey. And the reason for that was it was very masculine. All the role models for people in business were men, and had technological based businesses, etc., which is kind of the opposite of what I'm about. So it didn't resonate, but I read it again this year and it massively resonated, and I tied it more into a lot of my training in terms of discovering what kind of decision maker you are and where your decision making default is. And that falls into broadly three categories: the visionary, which is heart based, the architect, which is head based, and the builder, which is gut-based. And that training comes from some of my coach training as a multiple brain coaching. Those of you that have worked with me or have been listening to the She Rebel Radio, follow me on socials, etc., know that I talk about embodiment a lot. Head, heart, gut is a big part of that. But, we all have access to those areas of neural intelligence, okay? But the head often rules the heart. People often say to me as well, my heart gets me into trouble. And that is because of the wounded visionary. I meet women when I deliver this training, and women that I coach one-to-one and as part of groups and masterminds, and women, incredible women that come on my retreats. Whilst their natural default is heart-based, it is the visionary, it is starting with why, they have massive issue with trusting that part of themselves and that their heart knows the way. Because we have trouble in the collective, in modern society, in trusting our hearts over our heads. We've been told that that is not the good thing to do. We have been conditioned to believe that the head overrules the heart, and the head is really what you should follow, and logic over intuition, and all of those kind of things we've been very conditioned to do. Now, as women, not all of us, but many of us actually default more into that visionary, more into that intuitive, harmonic part of ourselves. But what we've seen is not only us as women, that not being trusted, not being permitted, not being allowed to lead from that emotional space. We've also seen that with visionaries across the board. And what I'm going to share with you here is, just think of the musicians. If any of you are a similar age to me, you can go 10 years lower, 10 years higher or more. It doesn't really matter, but you're going to know these people that I'm talking about. Just think about the musicians, certainly for me, that were around when I was growing up. So there was Michael Jackson, Whitney Houston, and George Michael, another one. And, we've lost those musicians in the last 10 years, I think. Is it all three of those that, icons growing up that died? We've lost those musicians, and they all went in a really painful, horrible way in terms of their suffering was pretty huge and immense. And that's because they were wounded visionaries. Those musicians, and many musicians are so heart-based, intuitive, harmonic, vibrational, all of that stuff. But what we've seen over the years, and particularly with a number of Black musicians and, music from R&B, soul and funk, all of that, is that those people, and this is, we're having band-aids ripped off in so many areas in terms of, the Black Lives Matter movement, women being empowered, etc., that, we're suddenly seeing things that we didn't see before. But those musicians were owned by their record labels. They were owned by the architects, and that's because historically the why people, because the why belongs to our hearts, it belongs to the visionary aspect of ourselves. The why people have been owned by the how people, because the why people, the visionaries, haven't known how or had the financial means to get their message out there into the world. So they become beholden to the how people. That's the record labels, etc. And this really, when I was really looking into this visionary architect builder stuff, I went to the pub on a Saturday and had a drink with my dad, who is a musician. So I've grown up around musicians and a lot of wounded visionaries. And he was telling me a story of a musician who my dad produced a blues album for, of his music in the 80s. I really remember this guy. He'd come over from Chicago. He was larger than life, incredible character. And Dad was telling me about the distrust that was between them. There was the racial side of that. But this guy, was an incredible musician. And, other people talking about his music couldn't believe that he'd never been signed by a record label. And that was because he was not prepared to give away his music and be owned by the how people. But he was wounded as a part of that, in terms of, not trusting those people that were getting his music out there. And that included my dad. And he went, who was a music promoter as well as a musician himself. And he went to work with some other white dude to help. And then actually went back to my dad and was like, "You're a really good guy. Can I come back and, get this music out there with you?" I said, this is like live gigs and producing that album, etc. But, my dad, what's really interesting, and this is, collectively, also was never signed for his music. He was almost signed as a musician when he was 19. He wouldn't change his music. He wouldn't be owned by the How people either. So these guys, different backgrounds, different races, they actually had a real heart-based connection of their wounded visionaries, and that just that makes me emotional just talking about that. But just as we were having this conversation, I was like, wounded visionaries, and I've actually been surrounded by a number of wounded visionaries growing up as musicians, artists, and I rejected that as a young child because I saw the pain that came with being a visionary and not necessarily knowing how to get your message out there in the world. That I decided to become a lawyer. I decided to become one of the How people, one of the architects, but my natural default is actually being the why person, the visionary. But what I saw was suffering that came with that. But we are now in a position, the internet allows, and the how becomes easier, and we are also more in touch with all those areas of neural intelligence that we have within ourselves, that heart-based and the head-based and the gut-based, that we can all put together, and get that support in from people without them owning us. And, in the Simon Sinek book, Start With Why, he talks about Walt Disney being a massive visionary. And I can't remember if it was his brother who was the How person, but even in that book it says if you're just if you're the why person and you don't know the how, you always stay broke. And think of how many musicians and artists we know that have stayed broke. They're the wounded visionaries. So where is that wounded visionary in you, that you have distrust of your visionary, of that vision? Like, just take a second to tune in with that. Because I know it's powerful, but there is a real reason that we, as I close this episode, I'm going to share why we need to start unleashing and leading from the visionary. That book, it says start with why, right? That's a big part of it. So checking in with that and where your wounded visionary might have shown up, because we carry this stuff ancestrally, we carry it for the collective, family members, etc. It was a real, I didn't trust my heart-based self. I, learned all the head-based stuff, and doing a law degree, practicing law was incredible in terms of, it really taught me to think, and it taught me the hows, and it taught me how to analyse and all of that stuff, but it also trampled all over my visionary, which was already wounded. So I really had to do the work to trust the visionary, trust that heart-based self that was desperately trying to lead, and my head and my inner architect not allowing it to do so. So we're going to move on to part 2, and pause this if you want to take a second to tune in with that yourself. We actually see this in social media as well. I see this so often with people like replicating and sounding like other people, and it's because we're desperately trying to tap into that wounded visionary, that voice and, heart-based why that is just actually belongs to you. So how do we start to heal? Because, I try not to use the word wounded too much, because I'm not a coach, advocate of women who believes that we are broken or victims. I don't feel that's helpful. I don't think that's empowering. But we do have to, at the same time, we can't paper over the cracks with positivity and skip along the road, down the yellow brick road, pretending that there are not difficulties. And I think if this year has really grounded that in, to personal development and, personal development online, etc., it is this year. So how do we start to heal that part of ourselves? And I was having a really great coaching session with a client where the issue of self-compassion came up. In fact, the whole session was around self-compassion. And this was, a coaching session around her business. But what was coming across is that whilst the struggle of the wounded visionary was to build this incredible business with such heart and compassion for others, yet there was a massive lack of compassion and heart for herself. So I'm going to say that again. Whilst this business was so focused on compassion and heart-based support for others, there was a massive lack of compassion and heart-based support for herself. And what that means is we're trying to fix things from the outside in. We're trying to make the world a better place from outside of ourselves, but we're not trying to do that from inside out, which is really where it starts. And that is because we can't have what we cannot be. You cannot have a very successful, beautiful, purpose-led business from a place of compassion if you're not being compassionate to yourself. And an indicator of not being compassionate to yourself is that wounded visionary, because you don't trust that part of yourself. You're not kind to that part of yourself. And we've heard in 2020 across the board, kindness really starts at home. And self-compassion looks different for every single person. And it really is about a case of starting small with yourself and finding that compassion. And I was really thinking about, because actually this client said to me, because there was a real struggle with, how can I show myself self-compassion? Because it was, the opposite of what was happening. It was quite alien to her. There was a time when it was totally alien to me. And, she said to me, well, how do you show yourself self-compassion? I love it when my clients throw the questions back. And it was either that weekend or a week later, actually. I've just moved and I'd booked outside yoga on the beach. And unfortunately, I was meeting my inner winter. That is my hormones. In my time of the month, and I was in so much pain that morning, and self-compassion for me that morning was staying in bed with a hot water bottle and a cup of tea and reading and having a salt bath and really nurturing myself at the time of the month that I needed it. And that was like a big act of self, not pushing through. That is a big sign of when you're not being compassionate to yourself, is you're pushing through all the time and not listening to yourself and not listening to your vision. Now that's one really small example. So I'm just going to throw that out to you. What would more self-compassion look like? The first question I've asked you is, connect with that wounded visionary. How's that showing up for you? And the third thing I'm going to share with you is why this matters. And as I said, I had a conversation with this client in terms of, is this really going to help me with my business? Lying in bed with a hot water bottle, whatever it might be, having a bath. And, I'm not going to go surface level in terms of self-care. Self-compassion is, having that kinder, gentler voice to yourself and treating yourself as you would treat others. But why is it important? It really is important. I was listening to the energy update of an intuitive energy guide called Lee Harris. I am going to put the link to his incredible videos in this podcast because I follow them every single month. An incredible guy. He's British, lives in America, and he channels, right? He reads energy, etc. And I know that might be over some people's heads, but stay with me here and watch him and listen to that. And I know many of you that listen to this She Rebel Radio frequently, you'll be totally up for this. He's talking about in September, the energy update it's the time for visionary activists instead of reactionary activists. And I've always considered myself as an activist in many ways and not in others, because I'm not reactionary. I used to be not so reactionary. And those of us that are not reacting and not wanting to react are really finding and trying to create a new narrative where we can respond. And that is the visionary activist. But how can we be a visionary activist if we have the wounded visionary is still exhibiting itself and you're showing yourself absolutely no self-compassion? The way that we are leading and changing and moving forward is the way of visionary activism. There is no room in the new paradigm, the new world, whatever you want to call it, and where we're going this next 10 years for the ego. It is about purpose-led and being heart-filled. It is about starting with why. And that is the reason why ladies, you need to take a look at your wounded visionary, where you're not trusting that, how you can show yourself more self-compassion, and how can you start to unleash that visionary activist that Lee Harris is talking about. Because now's the time. And as this podcast is so designed around, it's really the time for women within that to take the lead. And that includes you. So that concludes She Rebel Radio, our birthday episode number 59, Discovering Your Wounded Visionary. Thank you so much for being such a part of She Rebel Radio this past year. If you love the show and you haven't done it yet, please do leave us a review. Please do share She Rebel Radio with other incredible like-minded women who are so full of heart. Even when there's that wounding there, we're working through this. It's a practice, okay? It's a practice. It's not perfection, but it really is the time to start showing yourself that self-compassion and to start leading from that space. So do share with other incredible women. Do leave us a review, even if this is your first episode today and it's just totally resonated with you. And always reach out to me for my care and support and the incredible retreats we have coming up in 2021.
Thanks for listening to She Rebel Radio, the podcast for high-performing women leaders who want to unlearn conventional rules, leave prestigious careers, and launch businesses of significance. She Rebel Radio is executive produced and hosted by women's advocate and coach Lulu Mins. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to subscribe so you never miss another episode. You can find Lulu Mins on Facebook and LinkedIn at Lulu Mins and on Instagram at LuluMins_biz. Until next week, keep rebelling against the rules and designing success your way.